que debido al tránsito de Buenos Aires, entonces algunos de nuestros, no vamos a dar nombres, algunos de nuestros queridos conferenciantes no pudieron llegar exactamente a tiempo. Esta es una noche muy especial para el Seminario Rabínico. Contamos con la presencia de... Contamos con la presencia de literalmente eminencias de los conocimientos, de aquello que se puede llamar judaica. Gente que ha estudiado y profundizado en los conocimientos bíblicos, acerca de la actuación y del currículum de cada uno. La presentación estará a cargo de Miguel Toimacher, que es el presidente del Seminario Rabínico. Nuevamente, bienvenidos. רק מילה אחת בעברית לכם, זאת השפה המשותפת שלנו, כן? ריצ'רד, גם כי זאת שפה משותפת איתך, העברית, אז ברוך בואכם לביתנו, ומה שאמרתי זהו שאנחנו מתכבדים בכבוד מיוחד לקבל אתכם, שאתם מייצגים את השופרה שבשופרה בלימודי היהדות, כל אחד בתחומו. אז רב תודות לכם על תרומתכם לתרבות ישראל בארגנטינה, בהיותכם פה ובדבריכם ובלימודיכם. רב תודות. ניגש.
Buenas noches a todos. Y es un gran honor para mí darles una cálida bienvenida a este simposio de Biblia. Tener entre nosotros a estas cuatro personalidades es un verdadero orgullo para el Seminario Rabínico y sabemos que para ellos también. Somos la única institución en Latinoamérica capaz de reunir a tan brillantes estudiosos en materias tan profundas de nuestro pueblo. El profesor Emanuel Tov vive en Jerusalén, es profesor emérito de la Universidad Hebrea de Jerusalén, Pras Israel, entre muchas otras distinciones internacionales. Por el estudio de la Biblia recibió premios en Alemania, en la Academia Británica, honor doctoral en la Universidad de Viena. Bienvenido. Naomi Gretz, especialista en temática de Biblia y feminismo, lectura feminista de la Biblia. Fue durante muchos años profesora de la Universidad Ben Gurion en Beersheba, en el Negev, y autora de muchos libros en la materia y de numerosos artículos académicos. Bienvenida. El profesor Bezalel Porten es profesor emérito de la Universidad Hebrea de Jerusalén, es especialista en Biblia y autor de libros y artículos académicos muy citados: Los judíos de Elefantina, textos arameos, papiros y ostraca. El profesor y rabino y amigo de la casa, Richard Freund, doctor en Historia y Arqueología, y entre paréntesis se recibió de rabino en nuestra casa en el año 84. Es doctor en Historia y Arqueología internacionalmente reconocido. Es egresado de nuestra casa, actualmente es director del Centro Maurice Greenberg de Estudios Judaicos y profesor de Historia de los Judíos en la Universidad de Hartford, Connecticut. Ha dirigido y dirige proyectos arqueológicos en Israel proyectos en Europa en nombre de la universidad, también en España, en Burgos y en Cádiz, y un proyecto de investigación en el campo de exterminio de Sobibor en Polonia. Es autor de 6 libros sobre arqueología, 2 libros sobre ética judía y más de un centenar de artículos académicos y apariciones en documentales y televisión. Por supuesto, nos acompaña también el rector, el rabino Abraham Skorka, nos acompaña todo el staff del Seminario Rabínico y todos ustedes. Señores, vamos a escuchar a los profesores. Gracias.
It's a pleasure for me being here with your community. I'm afraid I have to speak in English. I don't know much Spanish. The topic of my small talk, my short talk, is what is the Bible? And I'm holding here in my hands one of the editions of the Bible, but this is a scholarly edition, it makes no difference. The general talk is, what is the Bible? The Bible is a beautiful book, elevated, with high intellectual and high intellectual values, which I have studied now for, who knows, maybe half a century. But if you ask me what is the Bible, there are many things I still do not know. I know what the Bible is today. I know in some ways what the Bible was 2,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago, but there are still many riddles. And if you remember this view that I uttered, it's important to indeed remember that there are many things we do not know. What we do know is that this book is the Holy Scripture of the Jewish people, that you know. It is also the Holy Scripture of the Christian people, and all in different ways. It is, in fact, not easy to accept the situation that the Bible, or so-called Old Testament, is Holy Scripture of different religions, and it is sometimes really complicated. At our conference, there's a book display, and I see there's a large sign which says Biblia del Pueblo de Dios. And I thought at first, this is very interesting, because I thought always that the people of God is the Jewish people. But this was not a Jewish edition, this is a Christian edition. And of course, the Christians consider themselves equally as much as the people of God as the Jews do. So this is the source of some difficulties. Now, and also the content of the Bible is different between the Jews and the Christians in different ways. Our Bible is called, not by Jews, but by Christians, Old Testament. We call it just the Bible, or Tanakh, or Hebrew Bible. The Christians added a segment to the Bible, which is the New Testament. But now things get more complicated, because the Christian Bible has a different content also for the Old Testament, because the Old Testament for the Christian Bible includes the books of the Septuagint, and these additional books are called Apocrypha. Apocryphal books or Sfarim Chitzoniyim. And here is a difference between the Catholics and the Protestants, because for the Protestants, these are really at the additional books, the Apocrypha, at the secondary level, but for the Catholics they are more elevated. And you get some very interesting situations, like we celebrate the festival of Hanukkah, but Hanukkah is not told in the Hebrew Bible. So it's in the Talmud, but it's not in the Hebrew Bible. But there's a very interesting situation, because the story of Hanukkah is told in the books of the Maccabees. And these books are in the Greek Bible and are sacred for the Catholics and of course for the Eastern Church, but not for us, because actually the apocryphal books, the Sfarim Chitzonim, they are forbidden by the Talmud. Kol hakoreh b'sfarim chitzonim en lo chelek b'olam haba. Anyone who reads in the Sfarim Chitzonim has no part of the world to come. So we celebrate the festival of Hanukkah, which has a base, official base, only in Christianity. This goes to show how complicated the history is of the Hebrew Bible, because these books were once part of the living Jewish tradition, but not anymore. After the beginning of Christianity, these apocryphal books were split off from Judaism, and they are not any part anymore in the Jewish religion. Now you look in the Hebrew Bible, Kaf Dalet Sfarim, 24 books. First of all, there still are some people who think that Torah is Bible. But of course, you know that's not true. The Torah, the 5 books of Moses, is only the very beginning of the Bible. And the Bible is Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, Tanakh. Now, if you look in the contents of the Bible, and you see that the Nevi'im, the prophets, are in the second part, but there's also one prophet in the third part, namely the book of Daniel. How is this possible? The Greek Bible arranged the books in a more logical way, you might say, because they have all the prophets together. But what do I mean, more logical way? It's secondary, because they arrange in the secondary level, they arrange the books, while the structure of the Hebrew Bible is more that of the historical growth, the development of the Bible. So first, the books of the Torah were finished, were accepted, were authoritative. Then the books of what we now call Nevi'im, Yoshua, Shmuel, etc., and the prophets were accepted. And only the third part, which has a strange name, Ketuvim, because there's no other name than Ketuvim means the written books. There's no other name that can really bring all the wide variety of these books together, and that has the book of Daniel, because it was really accepted by the Jewish people only at a later stage. Also, in that third part, you have the book of Ruth, the little book of Ruth. Now, the book of Ruth starts with the words, Vayi bimei shvot hashoftim, and it happened in the day of the judging of the judges. So that really belongs to the book of Judges, you might say. No, but that book was created later, and so it's only in the third part. Again, the Christian tradition, the Greek tradition has it in a better way, because they have the book of Ruth together with the book of Judges. I say better way, that's in quotation marks, because it's secondary. The Hebrew Bible reflects the way in which the books really developed. What is written in the Bible? Well, that not everyone knows, and there are various different kinds of books. Even books that you would not immediately think that are included in the Bible. Beyond the Torah, we have a large historiographic collection of books. The Bible is the history of the Jewish people. It's the religious history of the Jewish people from the beginning, from the creation until the very end, the book of Chronicles. Again, in the Bible they're not placed next to each other, because in the second compartment you have the books of Joshua until the end of Kings, and then Chronicles is not after the book of Kings, but it's only at the very end of the Bible. It's religious history. It is history from the point of view of the people of God that were created by God and were guided by God all the time. It's the history of the people that have a God that is forgiving, because the people of Israel often forgot their God, went to other gods. And the God of Israel said, okay, I will not destroy my people, and I will keep them in a safe heaven, and I will guide them all the time. So it's a very religious book. It's a religious book that was written by inspired writers. Now this is an issue some people may think, and maybe we will have different views on this. In scholarship we may have different views. It's not written by God. Not even the Torah is written by God. And I hope I do not disturb anyone's feelings. The books, and it's really already in the Talmud. In Baba Batra 14:15, it's already said who were actually the authors of the books, and God does not appear there. The 5 books of Moses were written by Moses. But how could Moses have written his book if it tells at the end in Deuteronomy 34 that he died? So Moses wrote most of the Torah, and the end was completed afterwards. And so Baba Batra tells us exactly what is the tradition about the authors of the different books. Scholarship goes a little further and will try to detect different layers, different compositions. Scholars will say, well, even the Torah is not all of one hand, because just think about it, it's not very easy that you have the laws of Pesach in Shmot, Exodus, in Vayikra, in Numbers, and actually also in Deuteronomy. So you have it in 4 different books. So there must be something that show the development of certain things. And scholars continue to quarrel about these things. We know the Bible from our editions, from the manuscripts from the Middle Ages, and we know the Bible from earlier sources, from the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are various views also on the relation between the biblical books, because sometimes 2 books tell the same story. For example, there is the book of Chronicles that tells the same story as Samuel and Kings. It's not the same, but it's very close. It tells us how a later writer considered this history of the Jewish people with new views. And you should really try to compare, because King Solomon and King David are better persons in the book of Chronicles. Solomon sins less, and David does even better things, more important things in the book of Chronicles. This is not a problem. So, but it's good to remember that within the Bible you have different views. What do we do with the book, with the Song of Songs? Some of you would have thought that maybe this is not a book that you would have immediately considered to be included in sacred history. Because what is the Song of Songs? It is a song that tells us about the love between a man and a woman. It describes the beauty of the woman. And what does that have to do with sacred history of the Israelite people, or the ancient Jews? Well, some people will say, well, the Bible really contains all that existed at one time of beautiful ancient writings. But the Song of Songs really entered into the canon, into the group of writings, together with an important interpretation. This is not the law between a man and a woman. This is the law between God and his people Israel. And if you accept that view, then of course there's no problem. Then and you can continue in the same way, and you see that the whole Bible, reading even the Song of Songs, is sacred history, sacred writings, inspired writings of the Jewish people of ancient times. Scholars say more or less until the 2nd century before the Common Era. This, in a nutshell and very briefly, is an introduction to my view of what is the Bible.
Nuestro agradecimiento a Emanuel. Naomi? Richard, please.
Ok, yo voy a hablar solamente 5 minutos en castellano para ustedes. Y después, todo lo que tengo acá es en castellano y yo voy a hablar en inglés. Ok, ¿basta? Ok. Antes de todo, quiero decir gracias a ustedes por venir. Es algo tan importante para el seminario tener personas de esta calidad de hablar sobre la Biblia. Yo voy a hablar sobre arqueología bíblica. No es exactamente la Biblia. La Biblia. ¿Sí es? ¿Es bueno para usted? ¿Sí? Ok, gracias. Lo bueno en todo esto es que arqueología bíblica no es una cosa, es muchas cosas. Lenguajes, países muy, muy distintos. No es solamente en Israel, es Egipto, Líbano, otros lugares, lenguajes. Si ustedes tienen el diario de hoy, era algo sobre Gilgamesh. Hay una exhibición ahora en UCA de Gilgamesh. Eso realmente es una influencia de lo que podemos decir de Sumeria. No es Israel. Es ahora Irak, ¿ok? Pero cuando decimos algo sobre esto, arqueología bíblica puede decir mucho más que lo que está escrito solamente en la Biblia. La Biblia no es solamente Tanaj, los 39 libros que tenemos en el Tanaj, o 27 libros que tenemos en el Nuevo Testamento, es también otros escritos, que hablamos de muchos escritos, no solamente de los judíos, influenciados por otras culturas. ¿Ok? Everybody's got it? Así es. Muchos países, many different countries. Everybody's got this? Vamos a ver. Sí, así es. No, es también Grecia. Grecia no es en el Medio Oriente, pero Grecia es muy importante para Israel. So when we talk about biblical archaeology, we're not talking about only Israel. We're talking about Egypt, we're talking about Mesopotamia, we're talking about Greece, Rome. We're talking about countries that are very different, with different cultures, and it's impossible to say that one thing is biblical archaeology. Everybody with me? Okay. This is what an excavation is. This is called, in Spanish, montículo. A montículo is very artificial mound, a tel. Ustedes conocen Tel Aviv. El nombre Tel significa really a layer cake. There's really only three laws. I'm going to give you the 3 laws of archaeology. Everybody's going to go away with at least this. You ready? The 3 laws of archaeology are ubicación, ubicación, y ubicación. Real estate, exactly. So why is that so important? It means that the same people are going to occupy the same space one time after the other. So when we look at something like this, we're looking at really a layer cake. Over here is the oldest part of a mound, and the top, and they all are micro-histories. So it's very simple. When we talk about archaeology, we're not talking about one period. We're not talking about only the period of the ancient Hebrew Bible. We're talking about different periods, and that's why when you talk about biblical archaeology, you really have to talk about a city, a place, a sitio, okay? And why did they build in the same place? Ubicación, ubicación, ubicación. If they had water, if they had agriculture, if they had a road, they're going to build in the same place. Do you ever hear of Buenos Aires? Okay. Everybody needs the same things throughout history. When we look at archaeology, we're looking at that kind of development. This is what a montículo looks like. When people go to talk about these things, it's an artificial, okay? It is not the same topography that we have in the same area. It's a different topography. You can see, this is sticking out of nowhere. And why did somebody abandon this? Why? Destruction, man-made, and destruction by nature. Sometimes it's just the change of a road, the change of sedimentation, an earthquake, something like that will change. And where do we find out all the information about a place with a very famous name? How many people have heard of Megiddo? Okay, that's bad. That's very bad. Megiddo is a very important place. You should all know it, because the end of the world is going to happen there. Armageddon is going to happen there. Har Megiddo is a place that has 20 different excavated layers. Same place, different times. Okay, I'm just going to talk about myself for a second. In the last 30 years, I've been excavating this one site. This one site is called Beit Saida. And today I was at the Archbishop's education, and I was talking to them about what we do in biblical archaeology and why it affects Christian archaeology, Catholic archaeology. This place is called Beit Saida because it was La Casa de los Pescadores, Beit Saida. Very well mentioned in Josephus, very well mentioned. Josephus Flavius was a 1st century historian, very well mentioned in the New Testament, and nobody knew where it was. but it was supposed to be on the Sea of Galilee. Well, people have been running around the Sea of Galilee, and by the way, the Sea of Galilee is not a sea. It's not even a good lake. It's in antiquity, Josephus says it's about 16 miles by 6 miles. Today it's about 12 miles by 6 miles. Just so you should go and visit before, okay? Just so you know. That and the Mar Muerto, you got to go before they disappear. Anyway, the important thing about this site was we had theories. And in biblical archaeology, it is not just reading a text like the New Testament and saying, oh, there was a place where 6 of the 12 disciples came and met with Jesus for the first time. Or, oh, there's a place where all these great miracles happened. Okay, and say, oh, that place, but we can't find it. So I want to tell you a little story. I was a student 40 years ago. And I had a New Testament professor who said, how do we know that the New Testament and the Hebrew Bible are all made up? How do we know? They cite them. How could there be a famous place where 6 of the great disciples of Jesus and all of the major miracles all happened in one place and nobody can find it on the Sea of Galilee? They were looking in the wrong place. Todos entendieron. Es tan importante. They were looking in the wrong place. They were looking at the present Sea of Galilee. And guess what, friends? The Sea of Galilee, over the past 2,000, 3,000 years, not only shrank, it didn't shrink. The sedimentation that comes down after earthquakes built up the coastline over a period of about 1,000 years. And the last big one that hit at the end of the 2nd century of the Common Era, no fishermen could bring their boats out to the lake anymore. And the Jordan River sedimented the whole thing in. So after 30 years, I can say something very important. Geology and geography is a part of biblical archaeology. And this is called now in Israel. When you go to northern Galilee, you'll see this. You go to the north shore of the Sea of Galilee. Guess what they call this? The Bethsaida Plain. And what was it 2,000 years ago? An open part of the lake, Bahia. And you can actually go out and fish very well in this area. And guess what we discovered 2 kilometers from the present Sea of Galilee? Huge anchors, 50-pound, 60-pound anchors, and lots of fishing equipment. So one of my colleagues once said at one of these conferences, a Congreso, at this Society of Biblical Literature, gee, Richard, it must be very hard to drag the anchors every day to work. And you know what the funny thing is? Once we proved that the sea was much bigger, I went to that colleague and I said, yeah, it's very hard to drag those anchors 2 kilometers, but to bring them to the bottom of the mound, no, it's nada. Not very, it's very easy. Anyway, let me show you just some things about that we know. For those of you who want to read this and watch this, and children close their eyes, this is what we discover in Israelite sites. These are little, we'll call them amulets, and very famous, Astarte, goddesses, very nicely shaped, and we discover them in Israelite houses. Now, when I was a young student, I had a teacher who wanted not to hurt my feelings, and he said, you know, Richard, we have things in the 10 Commandments, and when we find these things, these little amulets at Israelite sites, these weren't amulets. They were child's toys, tchotchkes. Okay, when I got a little older, I went and took an archaeology course, and guess what they told me? They said, you know what, not all the Israelites observaban todos los mandamientos de la Torah. Okay, if that were to say it, it's just out loud. Not everybody was observing the Torah perfectly. Oh, what a novel idea. What is it that we do in biblical archaeology? Just so you know, we are not going to prove the existence of any person. So nobody gets excited. Oh, did you find Abraham? We're not gonna, we may not. Wait, by the way, we've only found a few different people. Who are people? Who really are? Bar Kokhba. We found a firma de Bar Kokhba con sus cartas en una cueva en el Mar Muerte. Eso increíble. Eso increíble. But regularly we don't find anything about the people. But what we do find are things that illustrate, that give us a background of what is written in the Torah, that it's not just something made up by a bunch of rabbis in a back room 2,000 years ago. Hey, what crazy things can we make up today? This is an example. Oops. This is an example. And why is it a good example? Eso es un cesto de papiro de Egipto, de edad bronce. Y ustedes conocen que había algo en Éxodo sobre un señor que se llamaba Moisés en un cesto de papiro. This is an example. It's in the Cairo Museum. And whenever I take my students to Cairo, to the museum there, this is what I show them. I show them something like this. A little bit, and by the way, this was for, really, this was used for children when they died, because they didn't have places for them to be buried in all the different places. So what did they do? They put them in these little boxes, okay? And what did they do? They put them in the Nile, and that they sailed off into eternity. Now, when I read something in the Bible about the Pharaoh's decree against the Israelites, and I read that they're talking about a cesto de papiro, a very specific ark that they put the child in. This, to me, is what we find that can illustrate what the Bible says. Does it tell me about Moses? No. Does it tell me that the actualidad de la Biblia es algo actual? Yes, it does. And that is what biblical archaeology in the past 60 years has done, and electrified the public. And I want to tell you to whom it's very important. Para los jóvenes. Okay? For people who are under the age of 40 and 30. Because they need to touch, to feel, to sense the reality of the Bible, or we are going to not be reading the Bible in the next generation. So the last thing I'm going to say is, I want to invite you. You should go on an excavation. You want to change the way you think about the Bible? Go on an excavation. There are hundreds of excavations that are not only in, I'm only doing 4 excavations in Israel, but there are so many other places in Israel that are being excavated. Think about going, when you go to Israel, go on an excavation, a week, 2 weeks. Donate your time to really feel and sense the Bible. Has everybody got this? This is one of the big things I want. And the other thing I can say as a little ad, okay? I have books on excavating the Bible. It's called Excavando a través de la Biblia, Digging Through the Bible. And I have another book, Digging Through History. They're written for people like you, okay? It's not written necessarily for all the academics, but if you're looking for something to really get a sense of what it is that biblical archaeology can do for you, read a book like that. The other thing is, I want to tell you one thing about evidence. One thing about evidence. One of the things that you have to see when you are watching one of these documentals, okay, on Discovery and History and National Geographic, and I was in a number of them, if in the first 10 minutes of the movie they do not talk about pottery, and they're just talking about the blah 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 of the Bible, you know it's not going to be the most historically accurate. What it is that we talk about when we talk about biblical archaeology is artifacts. And artifacts speak more than just the text. But I'm going to say one thing, this is a freundismo. Tengo un freundizo, yo soy Freund, que eso es un freundismo. Yo tomo la Biblia seriamente, pero no literalmente. And that is, I think, the most important thing that I can tell you about biblical archaeology. If you want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, eso significa que no, I can't deal with the Bible. It's got too many things in it, okay? You have to use, if you really want to know what the Bible says, you have to use archaeology to understand it better. But I'm going to tell you another thing on the other side of this. All those archaeologists that I know that throw out the Bible and don't want to use it because it's difficult, it's too hard, it's got too many metaphors, we don't know when it's being symbolic, we don't know what. The most important thing we can do is take it seriously. We have to take the Bible seriously when we do biblical archaeology, because if we throw it out, woe to us all. Thank you.
Gracias, Richard. Espectacular. Esperamos pronto. ¿Escuchaste?
Miguel.
Will this be okay? I just have to find something right now. Okay, I'll do it like this. Okay, I'm going to be speaking about. Oh, thank you. I'm going to be speaking about a feminist Jewish approach to the Bible. And before I begin to talk about that, it's necessary to attempt to draw a portrait of elements that constitute or typify a Jewish approach to the Bible. Slide 1, please. What constitutes a Jewish approach to the Bible? The Torah is a living tree to those who uphold her, and whoever holds on to her instructions are happy. Right? You all know that from Proverbs 3:18. For those following a literalist approach, the Torah was revealed by God to Moses and Israel at Mount Sinai. The words of the Torah are the expression of God's will, and therefore it is the ultimate source of authority in this Jewish view. For those who follow this approach, one may protest or question God's will, but it remains the final source of authority as it is written in the Torah, Kakatuv B'Torah. Thus, little effort can be made to eliminate abuses against women that exist in the Torah by radically overhauling the entire received system. Indeed, this view may lead to denying that any such abuses exist in the Torah altogether. The view is that God's will would not do anything to harm women. If we perceive abuse, the fault must be in the way we understand Torah. This view, thus, is capable of generating explanations of Torah law which explain away what appear to be abuses against women in the Torah. Those who take a more anthropological approach view the Torah as a human creation, which, like any human creation, must be studied and understood in its social context. From the perspective of this view, there is no inherent authority in the Bible text. Thus, abuse and women's disabilities in biblical law derive from the social status of women at the time. If, in our time, biblical law translates into disabilities for women, then we need to effect a radical transformation and rethinking of Judaism. A third view takes a more middle ground. There are those like myself who, because of our religious orientation, respect the authority inherent in the traditional text. However, since our feminism is inseparable from our religious orientation and is viewed as part of our concepts of spirituality and holiness, its teachings must be integrated. We bring to the text questions from our time and seek to uncover meanings that we believe are dormant in the text that relate to these questions. We anchor our creativity within the text. Authority evolves out of the dialectic process of closely studying the text because of its importance and religious weight, while interpreting its meaning in terms of our own feminist and religious consciousness. One can consider Blue Greenberg to be representative of the first approach, Judith Plaskow of the second approach, and Phyllis Gribble and myself as a key to understanding the third or middle approach. Jewish people are expected to be literate so that we can read and understand our sacred texts. Text study is the meaning of religious experience, even the experience of revelation. The ideal is that the text represents a continuous medium on which Jews base their relationship with and their supplication to God. Having said all this, is there a difference between a Jewish and a non-Jewish approach? I think there is. We're going to read the scroll of Eicha on Tisha B'Av, which commemorates the destruction of the temples in a synagogue setting, just as Jews in Buenos Aires commemorated the destruction of Amiel last week. Thus, it is natural that the Jewish reader will read the book of Lamentations differently than the Christian reader of the Bible. Edward Greenstein has pointed out that Jews love the scroll of Esther, whereas Christians dismiss or tolerate it. Clearly, there are many who would say that the Jews deserved what happened to them. For some Christians, the biblical books are in some sense rejected sacred history. For a Jew, the biblical books are the rules of life itself. Slide 2. What constitutes a Jewish feminist approach? The Jewish feminist is influenced by general feminism, but tries to remain loyal to herself of being Jewish. She may define herself as a feminist Jew or a Jewish feminist. She may feel that Judaism and feminism are two competing isms, but she persists in seeing value in both. As a feminist, she might be tempted to reject Judaism in its entirety when the stakes get very high. But she too, like the non-Jewish feminist, considers this, and I use the same metaphor that Richard used, considers this throwing out the baby with bathwater. Rabbi Rebecca Alpert recognizes that exile from one's Jewishness is not necessarily the answer to the feminist dilemma. On the other hand, all of Judaism is called into question by feminism. The Bible is not just another book to the Jewish feminist, and she will criticize those who treat it as such. We treat with care the baby referred to above, the canon, so as not to abandon it. According to Alan Levinson, we Jewish feminists are in the awkward position of having to revision a biblical legacy while at the same time debunking tendencies to place the blame for the patriarchy, the West's oppression of women, and even the Holocaust on the biblical, read Judaic heritage. We are aware, as the late Tikva Kensky wrote, on the one hand, that Israel was neither the creator of patriarchy nor the worst perpetrator in the ancient world, and that the patriarchy of Israel was part of an inherited social structure. Nevertheless, we make a profound statement when we acknowledge that the Bible is patriarchal. Feminism makes us suspect the authority of our text, since we have been written out of the text, and we suspect that God was not necessarily speaking through those men who are responsible for a sexist-type Judaism. Yet, the feminist Jew is very much in a relationship with Judaism, even if the relationship is acrimonious. She may be angry, she may be apologetic, but she strongly identifies with her Jewishness and wants to either change it or live with it, or both, either in a state of conformity or rebellion. In other words, she has not written off her tradition. She may threaten the status quo. The establishment might view her as heretical, but she considers herself a member of the fold, even if there are attempts by the establishment to marginalize or silence her voice. Think of Women of the Wall in Jerusalem. She believes that by her efforts and those of others, that Judaism can and should be transformed. Our view of patriarchal Judaism is that if we look at it with fresh eyes, read feminists, we can change it. Slide 3. The relationship between feminism and Judaism can be described as one in which two different worldviews conflict. The feminist values relatedness, connection, togetherness, sisterhood, whereas Judaism posits separation and holiness. The Jew is commanded to set himself apart from other nations in order to be holy. The rationale behind it is stated explicitly in Leviticus 19:2, Vayikra. You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Holiness consists of both ritual purity and separation. To retain the chosen status, the nation is commanded, among other things, to separate itself from other gods and goddesses, from idol worship, from foreigners, the Gentiles, from forbidden foods, from women after childbirth, and from menstruating women. The Shabbat is a day which separates itself from the rest of the week, and the Jew is commanded to observe this day, to set it apart, and to engage in a totally different relationship to all of creation. The Havdalah ceremony, which marks the end of the Shabbat, sanctions hierarchy and separation. It creates an other-them relationship. The priestly laws assume a patriarchy, God on top, the high priest as intermediary, only he can go into the Holy of Holies to sacrifice, the lesser priests below, and still downwards the Levites. Further down are the normal Israelites, and below them are their wives and children. To retain the chosen state, men are required to be circumcised, which separates them from Gentiles and, of course, from women, who are often seen as being ritually polluted or impure, that is, the other. Part of the separation involves making boundaries, definitions. Thus, when a feminist approaches a Jewish text and rejects the separation inherent in the patriarchy, she threatens the traditional Jewish reading of the text. She comes to it bearing anti-hierarchical and anti-patriarchal biases. She notices gaps in the text, those that leave women out, those that do not name women, those that misrepresent women or those that punish uppity women. She will challenge those who want to minimize the possibility of multiple meanings of text. She will want to read women back into the text, missing a woman's presence when the traditional reading has not noted her absence. Slide 4. She will have noticed that the people and land and cities of Israel are depicted with feminine metaphors, often uncomplimentary ones, which you may have noticed in last Shabbat's Haftorah from Jeremiah. They are both at the mercy of the ruling God, who is sometimes depicted as an angry husband. I have written about Jerusalem the widow, which looks at the metaphors describing the destruction of Jerusalem. God is masculine and has terrorized his people, described in feminine metaphors, until she, cries out to God, Lama, why? Hopefully I will speak about this next Shabbat in B'nai Tikvah. To me, this is a text of terror, not only for Israel, but to women who are being re-victimized by the metaphors we use. These texts of terror have served as warnings to women to stay in their place. The feminists will want to re-examine and unpack texts that describe the traditional acrimonious relationship of Abraham's wives, Hagar and Sarah, the sibling rivalry between sister Leah and sister Rachel, the non-participation of Dinah in her rape, Yiftach's nameless daughter, the sex sirens and temptresses, Delilah, Potiphar's nameless wife, the story of the suspected adulteress, the Sotah, and the most frightening story of what can happen to an unprotected woman in a lawless society, the concubine at Gibeah, Judges 19. We have seen that the relationship between feminism and Judaism has many points which can be described as points of conflict. It might seem that within these parameters, the relationship of the feminist to the Bible is hopeless. Slide 5. In what ways can a Jewish approach be more compatible with a feminist approach? Is it possible to read feminism and Judaism as capable of harboring similar systems of value? If we look at the writings of Jewish feminists, we find that they are unwilling to give up on Judaism. They try and point to similarities rather than emphasize differences. How do we do it? There are those who take an apologetic approach, whitewashing approach. Rather than admit that there's something wrong with our tradition, they engage in comparison with other religions, seeing ours as less sexist than others, or look at historical context, contending that gender was not an issue for our forefathers. The danger of doing this is that it can lead to acceptance of what is and encourage lack of effort to make change. Another approach is to ask who owns the tradition, what is authentic, what is inauthentic, who decides. In this approach, we take an anti-monolithic approach to text. Levinson calls this pluriformity. There are majority and minority opinions. Both are preserved, not only in the Talmud, but in the Bible as well. There are more ways of reading the text that can be imagined, and there's no one right way to relate to the sacred tradition. This, of course, is the rabbinic approach. Turn it and turn it again, for everything is in it. I'm skipping a little bit. It is in keeping with the rabbinic approach to text that the feminists can transform those biblical texts that venerate the hierarchy of priests and kings to texts which see the real keys of power are learning and knowledge. And of course today, we open the doors to women to partake in the democratic pursuit of learning. The opening has always been there. If we remember the ancient debate between Rabbi Eliezer and Ben Azai on Tiflut in the Babylonian Talmud Sotah, women today are entering the doors of the rabbinate in all the denominations. I saw the pictures of the women outside of all the women rabbis who are being ordained and who were ordained. Yet I believe, despite all these good things, that we as Jews have more owning up to do. I think we have not yet understood the full and often unpleasant implications of the way God is portrayed. Think about this as you read the book of Eicha on Saturday night. Before rebuilding is possible, there must be confession, acknowledgement, and true repentance. However, with an honest confrontation and disavowal of the metaphors of abuse, combined with a midrashic development of the positive potential of the Bible, a greater, more inclusive and participatory Judaism can emerge. That Judaism can energize the Jewish people. It will resemble Sinai in that the entire nation, men, women, and children, will participate equally in hearing and interpreting God's word. That's it.
Of Marshall Meyer. We entered the seminary together in 1952, and the regular students who knew something were 4-year men. Those who knew a little less were 5-year men like myself, and those who knew nothing were 6-year men like Marshall Meyer. He was brilliant. He came from Harvard, and he decided to be a rabbi, and amazing what he did here. We all admire him. I am talking about the micro, please. The micro, please? Yeah? Okay. That's better? You like that?
Yeah. So we can listen to you.
Okay. I am talking about the rejection, the expulsion of Yishmael or Ishmael, and the election of Abraham, of Isaac. And I wanted to entitle this talk, as I had in other places, as Sight and Fright. But the Anglo told me that that doesn't go down in Spanish. So we gave this the expulsion and the election. Now, the question is, does the idea generate the word, or does the word generate the idea? And so sight is ra'ah, and fright is yareh. And these two words are very much alike. They sound alike. And so I created this term, three paraphanous pairs. And this is a talk that was given elsewhere, and we will take snatches from it. So, what is this word paraphanous? Paraphony, a term borrowed from music. Paraphony refers to two words which are similar but not identical in phonological form. Question, what's the difference between a jeweler and a jailer? Answer, one sells watches and the other watches sells. So, we have here these three words, Ra'ah Yareh, and Yashav and Shum, and Ra'ah, and also Reish Ayin, or Reish Ayin Hey. And they occur throughout the whole Bible. Almost every book of the Bible has these pairs. So they're not incidental or accidental. They are part of the biblical vocabulary, creation. And so I will show you here how the word sight, ra'ah, fright, yareh, explains the expulsion of Ishmael and the election of Isaac. Now, there's a word, I hope we will be doing a lot of Hebrew here. What is the word in the story of Ishmael for a flask of water? Does anybody know? Chemet. And it occurs 3 times in 3 different forms. And the letters are what? Chet, Mem, Taf. Now, what does Chet, Mem say to you? Cham. And who was Cham? He was?
The son of Noah.
He was one of the sons of Noah. Was he the good son or the bad son? He was a bad son. Because when they came out of the ark and Noah got drunk, Ham went and covered him. Good. And the two brothers went like this, not looking. And so when Noah discovered it, he cursed Ham. He cursed Ham. Now, Ham had sons, Egypt, Mitzrayim. You are what your father is. So Mitzrayim had a bad name. And we have 3 stories in the Torah one about a king who was suspected of wanting to kill the husband and take the wife. So when you see this Hagar, what was she? Where did Abraham pick her up? In Egypt, in Mitzrayim. So already, she's taken. And when the story says that this flask is a chemet, you hear the echoes. So let's have a look at here we see a sequence, Abraham. And what is this sequence? It's between a very tricky thing here. It's between Yoshev and Vayad. So God is appearing, Vayeda Elav Adonai, appearing to Abraham. And where is Abraham? Yoshev. He is sitting. And he sees, Vayad, he sees, and he sees these men coming. So Abraham sits and sees, Yoshev and Ra'ah. So 2 of these word pairs. Lot. Vayavo Shnei Hamalachim. 2 angels come to Lot. You know who Lot was? He's the nephew of Abraham. And what is Lot doing? These things are right next to each other. The Lot, Yoshev, Vishad, Stom, Vayad. So both Abraham and Lot are sitting and seeing. Now this is a promo. Okay. So now we come to the expulsion of Ishmael. And we see how these words build up the narrative to tell why he was rejected and he was elected. So here is Sarah. Vatena Sarah et Ben Hagar, and I omitted Hamitzri, but that's what's there. Mitzachek. Now, Mitzachek is of course the word play on Yitzchak. But here, Ben Hagar is Mitzachek. Now, where else did they Mitzachek in the Bible? They Mitzachek. Where? The Mitzachek when they built the golden calf, and Abimelech saw Yitzchak Mitzachek with his wife. So, 2 great examples of Mitzachek doesn't mean playing, but it means playing. You know, the way a woman, a boy, and a girl play. Playing around. So, what is this Mitzachek? Well, the text is elliptical. But when you know the meaning of this word, You see that he wasn't just playing jacks. And so what does she do? Right? She's expelled. She has Hagar expelled. And there's Hagar out there. And the water runs out from the Chemet. And so what does she do? She says, Malachagar al tiri. So she sees, and God says, don't be afraid. And so she sees, Vateta be'er mayim. Vatash et hana. So here, Sarah saw playing Ishmael, and he is expelled. Hagar saw and drink for Ishmael, and Ishmael is saved, as we see. Now, if you see a bush in the desert, what must there be there? Water. Why didn't she see water? She's afraid. And so she abandoned her son. So look at all these strikes against her. Now, we come in with the other part of the word there, Ra'ah with an aleph and Ra'ah with an ayin. See, bad. And so you see that when Abraham hears what Sarah wants, Vayeda hadavar ha'od b'nei Abraham al odot beno. Vayeda, it was bad. And God says to him, Al yeda, let not be bad in your eyes. Al hanad, ki v'yitzchak yikarei l'chazara. So here you have the ayin reish, the ayin reish, the ayin reish. Lovely sounds. Sounds are very important. And that's embedded in what we saw before. Sarah's sight leads to Abraham's displeasure. No displeasure, God said. This nod will not be the zera. Okay? So now there's another layer. And what is this layer? We saw Abraham sat, Lot sat, and saw. Hagar saw. Hagar sat, but refused to see. V'telech v'teshev la mineged harchet v'tachavei kasher. So she doesn't want to see him. She's afraid. So she puts him over there. Now the word is v'tashlech. You take your concordance, look up tashlech in the Bible, and you see that it means throw away. It doesn't mean gently put down. So she's abandoning him. Al eleh b'mod hayalad v'teshev. So Hagar sat a bow shot away, v'tachavei kasher, and Ishmael is a bowman, a shot, but neither sees. They both sit. She sits, and he out there sits. So Hagar sat, but refused to see. Al ereh. See, these single words are building up the whole concept. They're telling you about this woman and comparing her to Abraham and Lot, and she doesn't come out well. Now here's the binding of Isaac. And this is just beautiful. Because we have these two words, sight and fright, yarei, ra'ah. And they create a chiasm. Not a chiasm, but a balance, a symmetry. Here is the A, and here is the A. ולך לך על ארץ המוריה. וירא את המקום, he saw the place. And Abraham, Isaac asked him, well, where's the sacrifice? And he said, Elohim Yerelo. So A, B, C. Here's the place, here is Abraham seeing, and here is God seeing. He will see too. He'll provide. See too, it's a good English. And what's in the middle? Ki yadayadati ki yarei Elohim ad. So he sees and he fears. But it's not fear, it's awe, it's yarei Elohim. So we go back now. Vayisav Abraham et einav vayar. V'hinei ayil, and he sees a lamb. Vayikra Abraham shem v'komu Adonai yireh. Asher mebahar Adonai yeda'eh. So here is a place, Moriah, here is the Adonai yeda'eh. Here he sees the place, and here he sees the isle, and here he says that God will see too, and so the mountain is called Adonai yireh. And so that proves that Abraham was right. He believed that God was not going to have him sacrifice that kid. Now what happens when you take Yarei Yara and you introduce Shuv Yashav? You get this construction. Okay? So here the ABC and CBA are Yarei Yara. But if you introduce Shuv Yashav, back. What do you get? Here, Abraham says to the servants who accompany him, Shvu, he says, El Ne'arav, Shvu lachem im ha'chamor, sit here with the donkey, and I and Yitzchak will go to Nashuva Aleichem. So, Shvu and Shuv. And how does it end? It ends with Abraham. Vayashav Abraham el Me'arav, he returns. And then, Vayeshev Abraham v'Be'er Shava. So, that's A-B, B-A. Shvu, Nashuva. Vayashav, but you get this nice construction, you know, surgery, A, B, E, F, C, D, B, C, A, F, E. So, Hagar had fright, and therefore she lost. Abraham had awe, not just fright, but awe. Yirat Elohim. And so his son won.
A continuación, vamos a, si alguien desea hacer alguna pregunta a cualquiera de las cuatro profesores.
Al doctor de arqueología, no recuerdo el nombre. Richard.
¿Quién es?
Ariel.
Ok, Ariel.
Les quería preguntar si puede contarnos un poquitito, después de tantos años de experiencia con la arqueología, a diferencia de lo que vemos en la televisión, ¿cómo era la gente? Pregunto cosas banales. Cuando uno camina por Israel y ve los tilim, son chicos, son cosas chicas. Yo me imagino Beersheba, de la época de Abraham, cosas muy diminutas. Jerusalén, las partes más grandiosas pueden ser en términos de hoy muy chicas. Am Israel salieron 600.000 de Egipto. Abraham vivió, Moshe 120
My
años.
gosh, he's doing his own lecture here.
No,
So to get ready. So
Me gustaría saber,
I'm going to give you a summary of this
después de
afterwards.
30, 40 años excavando en algunos lugares,
Yeah.
¿cómo era la persona, el común y corriente? ¿Cómo vivía, cómo se vestía?
Okay. His question really is the basic question that we have in archaeology, is what do we really learn about the people? And the people really, anytime somebody tells you that archaeology is about architecture, or it's about walls, or it's about objects, it's not. It's about people. And when we forget that, that's when archaeology becomes, woo! And by the way, the stones do not talk to anybody. They all need a very elaborate construction of theories in order to understand them. So first of all, what do we understand about the ancient Israelites, for example? In all of when you go around Israel and they take good tour guides, take you to each one of these places, and you learn about the people of that place. First of all, you learn that they are regular people living regular lives, not extraordinary lives, okay? They're not biblical heroes. They are regular people. And what do we learn about their lives? They try to live simply. We do have luxurious places in places like Jerusalem, but the differences in every period are so extensive. So for example, when someone asks me, what existed in a place like Jerusalem in the time of the legendary King David? Something much different than what we see in the period of Herod. Okay? So it's really hard to compare what the population was. It was a very small area. And so when people try to excavate a small area that's been built on 40 times and destroyed 52 times and completely destroyed twice, it is so complicated. It is not just, well, like I'm lucky. I go to places where nobody has touched it, okay? And I excavated very simply. We put up the walls. We understand what they were doing in their houses. But I'll give you a simple thing, because it's not just King David. When people ask me, what do we learn about Jews in the first century of the Common Era? What we learn is they are so different in different places within Israel in the first century. Jerusalem, first century, is so different than Galilean. And so we look at the houses, the size of the houses. For example, for those of you who haven't studied archaeology, how many ancient synagogues do we have in Israel before the first century? You know why? Because what we think is that people didn't have what we call an edifice complex. You know what an edifice complex is? An edifice complex is, you should know very well here in this country what an edifice complex is everyone has to have their own building. Instead of thinking about what in antiquity, you know what people did? Did people pray when there was a temple standing in Jerusalem? Of course they prayed. They didn't go, they said, I gotta wait another 3 months until I'm gonna go to the temple. So what do we have? We have houses. Courtyard houses. Courtyard houses where people could actually do lots of things besides just talk to one another. They could pray, but they didn't have to have necessarily a synagogue with a special walls, with special seating, with a special person standing in front of them. This is really the difference. So when we're looking at, for example, we excavated a very large fisherman's house with a big courtyard. And when people come there, they say, where's the synagogue? I want to see the synagogue where the disciples of Jesus met for the first time with I said, you know where they met? In the fisherman's house, in a courtyard, and that's what they did. So part of the problem is we have in our own minds a vision of a Judaism that existed in the medieval period, that existed in the Babylonian period. And what we do when we go out into the field is we have to keep in mind the text, but we have to forget about what we think of what the interpretation of that text is from the medieval period, from the Babylonian period. That's very hard to do because you have to always be almost schizophrenic. You have to be looking at things that you're looking at and say, what was the use of this cup? This stone cup. Why were they using stone cups? What was so important about stone cups? And then you understand, we're looking at a Jewish house. Because who used stone cups? Jews used stone cups. And how do I know that Jews used stone cups? Because it is written in the Talmud about the stone cups. So we're looking at a desarrollo, we're looking about an evolution, we're looking about different Judaisms. You know, Professor Tove is an expert on the Dead Sea Scrolls. When people ask, what do we learn from the Dead Sea Scrolls? And I hope someone will ask him what he has learned over the past 40 years of being in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It is such a different Judaism that we are talking about. And what's very important about the scrolls is it tells us about the Judaism, los movimientos de judíos, okay, de aquel entonces. Not about modern movements, about ancient movements of the Jews that really were different, that had different theologies, that had different buildings about the way they lived their lives. So when you ask a question like that, you have to say, what specifically are you interested in? The other thing is, never forget, tomamos la Biblia seriamente, pero literalmente. The numbers of the Bible that we read may be a very big problem. Okay? So archaeologically, that's the other problem. To read it seriously, but not literally. Okay, yeah.
Una pregunta más.
כן, אנחנו...
Bueno, sin saber que sos especialista en los rollos del Mar Muerto, sí, para que vos hablaste de los libros que quedaron fuera de la Tanaj, cómo decidieron cuál que quedan fuera, cuál que se entran, y lo que hablaste del Hanukkah, que fue muy interesante, que es de algo de los cristianos, y sí tenemos adentro, pero otras festividades que están en otros libros y que no entramos en estas libros.
לא דיברתי על הפסוקים.
באנגלית, באנגלית.
זה שאנחנו חוגגים חנוכה למשל, שהוא ספר שאנחנו לא מקבלים, איזה ספרים נכנסו, איזה ספרים נשארו בחוץ?
Okay. 5 minutes or 2 hours? 2 hours. Much of this, well, goes back to actually to the time of the creation of what we call canon. And canon is a word that means the collection of sacred writings. And the collection of sacred writings, as I said, for the Hebrew Bible, grew over the ages. There were ancient books that were not included in the Hebrew Bible. It's actually quite interesting that Chronicles is in the Hebrew Bible because it tells the same story. But it's there. And the Hebrew Bible was closed at different stages. So first the Torah, then the Ketuvim, then the Nevi'im, and then the Ketuvim. But this is really only one, it's really interesting because this is only one group, it's only one concept of the sacred writing, one concept of what we call canon, one canonical concept. And so what you're asking refers to my remarks in the books of the Maccabees, which are not sacred anymore for the Jews. That is because there was another group of sacred writings that is reflected in the Greek translation of the Septuagint, and that later became Christian. But that was another Jewish concept, because the Septuagint is completely Jewish. There's nothing Christian about the Septuagint. And, well, we now connect it with Egypt, but it's really not connected with Egypt. It's partly connected with Egypt because it also reflects concepts of the Hebrew Bible as were accepted in ancient Israel. So there were different understandings of what should be included in the Hebrew Bible. We live according to one concept, and there was this other concept that is sometimes called the Alexandrian Bible, but that's not a good name because some of these books were also accepted in the book in the land of Israel. So it's a different concept, and because religions developed in the way they developed, and without mentioning God, these things could not have been foreseen. So our canon developed in a certain way, the canon of the Septuagint developed in a certain way, and there's even more canons. The situation in Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, is unclear. But it is quite sure that in Qumran we have, I mean, it's a fact that we found in Qumran many books, and there are certain books about which we can say they were also accepted as authoritative. So you might also say that the canon of the Qumran people, whom we call Essenes, which is a deviating group. What is deviating? It's a different group. They deviated from the Pharisees. So in the place of Qumran, in those caves, we find, for example, many copies of the Book of Jubilees. Now, the Book of Jubilees is not known to most of you, Sefer Yovlim. And that one was most likely accepted by the people in Qumran. The Temple Scroll, also not known to most of you, but one of the important writings found in Qumran, was most likely also accepted by the people of Qumran. So different, at this time you might say, for the Common Era. Not anymore in the first century of the Common Era, but let's say until the time of Jesus, until the year 0, there were different understandings. How could people live in this way? It's not easy. But there was no mass communication, so each group lived in its own way. Judaism at that time was pluralistic. We only think in terms of Tanakh as we have it, but that is, and I think it's not in this building, which is a conservative building, I can easily say this, that Judaism is pluralistic, and at that time it was definitely pluralistic. And this created all those strange things. I might just as an appendix say, the Samaritans are again different. Because the Samaritans that you will know from modern Israel, it's a very small group. It's a group of maybe 800 people. They live in Shem, Mount Gerizim, like Gerizim. They live also in modern Holon, near Tel Aviv. And they have again a different canon. They only accept the 5 books of Moses.
Literally.
and in a slightly different way from our Torah. So Judaism, and I could say even more about the Karaites, but these are the more salient features of how the understanding of Scripture developed in Judaism and later on also in Christianity, etc. It's much more complicated.
Thank you. Antes de despedirnos, me gustaría contarles también que se encuentra en Buenos Aires el profesor Eitan Shikli, que ha venido junto con dos coordinadoras que son Silvana Candel, que pertenece al staff del seminario y vive en la ciudad de Haifa, y Dina. Ellos vinieron a una misión, pertenecen a la escuela Tali de Israel. Las escuelas Tali de Israel atienden alrededor de 60.000 alumnos en escuela primaria y más de 200 jardines de infantes. Hemos tenido ya 3 jornadas de 8 horas cada una con presidentes de las escuelas, con coordinadores, directores y morim, que han sido un éxito para poder introducir el programa y el sistema Tali en las escuelas de la red escolar judía de Buenos Aires, de la provincia y de todo el país. Ojalá que esto se haga realidad para el mejoramiento de nuestra educación judía en todos lados. Por el otro lado, agradecemos sinceramente a estos 4 eméritos profesores, rabinos, que han podido estar hoy con nosotros y los comprometemos para hacerlo nuevamente. Gracias. Toda Rabá a la gente.